I have been working on the topic of Auschwitz prisoner doctors for almost 20 years now, and was deeply perturbed to see that recently they have increasingly been the target of accusations that they collaborated with the Nazi doctors in the camp, causing suffering among fellow inmates, being responsible for the death in the gas chambers or by lethal intracardiac injections, participating in cruel experiments carried out on prisoners by the SS doctors, performing abortions on pregnant women prisoners, killing babies who were born in the camp, etc. The ultimate, most shocking allegation that I have found is the following, and this is a quote. Jewish prisoner physicians played a significant role in the Nazis' exploitation and attempted annihilation of European Jewry. And another quote, utilizing the medical training, they facilitated Nazi goals to varying extents and in a multitude of ways. The word annihilation, in German Vernichtung, is the very word Hitler used in several speeches starting in January 1939 about his plans to wipe the Jews from the face of the earth. The quotation I just read out is taken from the announcement for a lecture given on May 20th, 2015 at the Vienna Simon Wiesenthal Institute by Sari J. Siegel, a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California, who is due to defend her thesis this month. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to obtain the text of her lecture. I will first attempt to explain what I believe is meant by the allegations I have just read, before presenting some others that have been made against the former prisoner doctors. I will then proceed to defend the memory of prisoner doctors, showing that the accusations against them are both unjustified and unfair. My examples will be drawn from the writings of some of the close to 60 Auschwitz prisoner doctors whose writings form the subject of my book, as well as from my father's story. My father, Jacques Levin, or Jakub, or Kuba, or Kubush, was the longest surviving Jewish male prisoner doctor in Auschwitz, having arrived with the very first convoy from France, which was also the very first from Western Europe, on March 30th, 1942. So, what exactly are the prisoner doctors being accused of? First, of helping the Nazis exploit other Jews. Already, Jews who arrived in Auschwitz in the spring of 1942 were employed building the new camp of Birkenau under extremely harsh conditions, including beatings by capos, which resulted in many deaths. After July 1942, the arriving Jews were subjected to a selection which separated young, healthy-looking prisoners judged to be fit to work from women, children, and elderly persons who were immediately killed in the gas chambers. Starting in December 1942, SS camp doctors were ordered to improve sanitary conditions in concentration camps. The aim was to maintain and even increase the workforce which was needed to further the German war effort. At first, only non-Jewish physicians were allowed to work as doctors in Auschwitz. And Jewish prisoners could only be employed as Pfleger, nurses, alongside other inmates who were not medically qualified. However, starting in March 1943, after the SS doctor Edward Wirz became the head camp physician, and thanks to Wirz's secretary, the Austrian prisoner Hermann Langbein, Jewish doctors were allowed to work as physicians also, but only as long as they treated Aryan patients, Aryan. No doubt in persuading Wirz to allow Jewish physicians to work in the camp hospitals, Langbein's intentions was also to help not only those doctors, but also the fellow inmates who benefited from their care. By an ironic twist, the prisoner doctors' efforts to help and even save fellow prisoners are now made to look as if they had in fact contributed to the Nazis' goal, not only to exploit Jews, but also to further the Nazis' attempts to overcome their opponents, including the Allied forces that they were fighting. I'm not sure what to say about the alleged, quote, significant role of the prisoner doctors in the attempted annihilation of European Jewry, as I was not present at the talk. But I believe it to be such a gross distortion of facts that it does not even need to be refuted. In order for this statement to be afforded even some degree of credibility, it would have to be supported by statistics on the number of deaths for which prisoner doctors were supposedly responsible. The prisoner doctors were accused of utilizing their medical training to help the Nazis. This statement implies a deliberate intent on the part of those men and women to assist the Nazis. This was not the case, quite the reverse. Most of the prisoner doctors utilized their medical knowledge to thwart the Nazi physicians' plans to harm prisoners. In a previous article, Sari Siegel strove to show that the attitude and behavior of prisoner doctors evolved over time and that the same prisoner doctor could either decide to help fellow inmates or to harm them. She based her theory on the cases of 3 prisoner doctors, 2 of whom, the Catholic Pole Władysław Dering and the German Jewish gynecologist Maximilian Samuel, are known to have taken part in castration and or sterilization experiments on Jewish prisoners. But the third one, the French psychiatrist from Alsace, Adélaïde de Val, is unanimously hailed as an exceptionally courageous human being who refused to assist the Nazi doctors, Edward Wirtz and Josef Mengele. Dr. Oval was recognized in 1965 by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations, but according to Siegel, the bestowing of this honor was not justified because the Alsatian physician had anesthetized 1 or 2 women in Block 10 where these experiments were taking place. Siegel seems to imply that this fact was hidden from the Yad Vashem Commission so that they were unaware of the whole picture. This was not the case. I will skip, because of lack of time, some of the other accusations by, for instance, the Australian researcher Adam Brown, who generalizes from the case of the Hungarian physician Miklos Knisley, who assisted Mengele in dissecting the bodies of his victims, and who alleges that Knisley's case was just one of many. Another researcher, Marius Turda, examined Knisley and also generalized from Knisley's behavior, which, in my opinion, and well, I don't think it's really an opinion, I've examined, as I said, close to 60 writings of prisoner doctors who not only wrote about themselves, but about the colleagues in the camp. And I can say that Knisley's case is quite unique about the way he collaborated, apparently as much as he could, with Mengele. Now, I would like to point out that not only were the prisoner doctors acutely aware of the ethical problems which they faced while attempting to reconcile their desire to help patients and the limitations which they had to observe in order to remain alive themselves. In fact, the group of prisoner doctors, as well as the resistance movement in the camp, exerted moral pressure on members of the group not to infringe certain rules, and I don't think this is well known at all. This was explained by the Polish Catholic physician Stanisław Kłodziński, who was a very active member of the resistance movement and helped many prisoners to survive, including Jews, like my father. Kłodziński outlined 4 guiding principles medical workers had to adhere to. Number 1, it was forbidden for them to assist in the extermination of prisoners. However, some actions which could not be avoided were tolerated, such as lifting patients onto trucks bound for the gas chamber, taking prisoners to the room where they were going to be administered lethal fentanyl injections, carrying out bodies of executed inmates, etc. Number 2, since generally the medical personnel could not help or treat all of the ill prisoners, priority had to be given to the young who stood a better chance of surviving the camp, and also to those among the prisoners who deserved to remain alive because of their behavior in the camp, because of the behavior before they were deported. Number 3, it was the duty of the medical prisoners to conceal or falsify diagnoses of infectious diseases so as to prevent patients from being sent to the gas chamber. Number 4, participation in criminal medical experiments was forbidden. However, if it could not be avoided, medical workers had to ensure that as little harm as possible was done to the subjects and that the SS would derive as few benefits as possible. If a prisoner doctor did not comply with this code of conduct, he or she was ostracized and given a warning. Kłodzinski had added that these guidelines did not preclude medical workers from experiencing heart-rending dilemmas when trying to assist fellow inmates to the best of their abilities. I will now turn to countering the accusations made against prisoner doctors. First, did they contribute to the Nazis' war effort? One must bear in mind that all the prisoners who were not sent to the gas chambers on arrival were obliged to work for the Germans. Prisoners were made to work as construction workers, even if they had no experience in the field, and in any other possible way that was useful in the camp. Work details came back to their blocks after a day's work carrying the bodies of prisoners who had been killed by the guards and the capos. Physicians also had to toil at times under inhuman conditions, for instance, digging trenches 4 meters deep, as reported by the Polish physician Czesław Wincenty Jaworski. Of the 10 Jewish doctors who were in that group, only my father remained alive. So all prisoners, without exception, were made to contribute to the German war effort. 51 German companies, Siemens, Krupp, IG Farben, etc., and also German branches of foreign companies like Ford and Kodak used slave labor in the Auschwitz camps and satellite camps. Prisoner doctors were likewise exploited by the Germans, since the only reason they were allowed to treat fellow inmates was that they could be sent back to work. To be sure, when they worked in the camp hospitals, in quotation marks, or laboratories, which for the vast majority of them was not during the whole stay in the camp, prisoner doctors enjoyed better conditions. They were protected from the harsh Silesian climate, very cold in the winter, very hot in the summer, and as a rule, they were not subjected to beatings and to the ordeals of roll calls. What was almost unique to the situation of prisoner doctors was that while working in the hospitals, they were able not only to alleviate the sufferings of the sick and wounded fellow inmates, using the extremely limited means at their disposal, but in many cases, they succeeded in saving the lives of prisoners by protecting them from the Nazi physicians. I'll just give a few examples. They falsified diagnoses, hid patients from selections in the hospitals, managed to employ some patients as nurses when they were not qualified for the job, but they also often risked their own lives while doing so. The French surgeon from Alsace, Robert Lévy, wrote that when he tried to plead with Mengele not to select a prisoner for the gas chamber, if he insisted too much, Mengele would threaten to send him to his death with the patient. So working as a prisoner doctor in Auschwitz was certainly not a guarantee for survival. A young French physician, Désiré Hafner, who was there from the summer of 1942, wrote that of the 40 doctors from France who were still alive in August of 1942, only 3 returned in 1945. In my close reading of the articles and memoirs of former Auschwitz prisoner doctors, I have not found any other example than that of Knisley of friendly relations with the SS physicians. Knisley gave one example of Mengele calling him my friend. And apparently Mengele also offered him once a cigarette, but whether that was real friendship is highly debatable. A number of other prisoner doctors were made to assist the Nazi doctors with their experiments. And it is true that these experiments could not have been carried out without their assistance, but in most cases, the prisoner doctors did their best to sabotage them. I won't have time to give many examples, but in the case of pharmaceutical experiments, the 5 minutes, thank you. The prisoner doctors advised subjects to spit out the preparation they were given, or they themselves diluted the preparations. One example, which I think is significant, one Czech medical student who worked in the main camp hospital was ordered one day by Wirtz, the chief Nazi doctor, to find 2 prisoners to serve as subjects for an experiment on narcotics. After a while, he returned and told the Nazi physician that he could find only one. When asked where that prisoner was, he replied, "It's me." He was chided, but nothing else happened to him. According to a young friend of my father's in the camp, who was 18 years old at the time and worked in the Reichsco Hygiene Institute as a lab technician, my father had vowed never to help the Nazis with a rapid method for determining blood groups, which they were hoping to use on soldiers wounded on the Russian front. My father kept stalling, pretending to be unable to continue with the experiments because he needed some particular piece of equipment which took a long time to arrive from France and which in fact never arrived. Another example of resisting the Nazis' orders was how my father persuaded Weber, the Nazi doctor who was head of the Reichsco Hygiene Institute, that he could find a method for determining blood groups from saliva. The subjects of this harmless experiment were a group of women in Block 10 who had to spit every morning into test tubes and in exchange received better and more abundant food rations. At the same time, they were protected from cruel sterilization experiments. As I mentioned before, Adélaïde Duval is now being accused of not having deserved the title of righteous among the nations. Because, in fact, she is made to look as if she had hidden the fact that she had administered anesthesia to one or two women prisoners in Block 10. In fact, this is inaccurate. In a letter to David Alcalay, director of the Department of the Righteous Among the Nations at Yad Vashem, dated November 13, 1964, Leo Norris, the American novelist, who was one of the defendants being sued by Daring, stated that he had instructed his London solicitor to send Yad Vashem the complete transcript of Dr. Oval's testimony. And in her testimony, Dr. Oval had testified under oath that she had used Evipan only once. 2 minutes, okay. Well, it looks that if there were cases of collaboration, this was only done by Polish Catholic doctors who were known to be anti-Semitic. Daring, of course, was one of them, and there were a couple of other Polish prisoner doctors who, as I said, were anti-Semitic. I won't be able to give any more examples, and I'm afraid I'll skip the rest. I'll just like to conclude by quoting from a poem a young prisoner, young woman prisoner, wrote in recognition of the work and this was in a forced labor camp, and I don't even have the details. This is something I found in a book. And this is what she wrote about also the young prisoner doctor in that camp. And this was in Yiddish, it was translated. And she called this doctor the goddess of the sick. Our doctor, our goddess, is always nearby to chase the pain and the sorrow with words of love, with words of hope, hope for a better tomorrow. Her daily care, pills of faith, a smile, a touch of the hand. We gain strength from her strength, we gain hope from her hope, warmed by the rays of her love. And that's all I have time to say, so thank you very much.